Next presenter, you may know, you should know the byline, the name. Callie Enlow is a freelance journalist, editor based here in San Antonio, done all kinds of stuff. Her culture reporting, interviews, and reviews have appeared in Bomb, The Onion AV Club, that's out of Austin, Spin.com, and Soundcheck magazine. Also, previously, she worked as a government reporter for the Williamson County Sun newspaper, the assistant editor of San Antonio magazine, and the music and film editor of the San Antonio Current. And she is a real journalist with a capital J, with a Master of Science in Journalism from Columbia University in New York City. Give it up for Callie Enlow.
So I recently spent about 10 weeks in Burma, and that's what my presentation is about, and I tried to make it relevant to the forum today, so I'm just going to start. Okay, so Burma is a Texas-sized country in Southeast Asia. Due to Burma's repressive military regime, which is now a democracy, an awful human rights record, most Western countries have strict economic sanctions, and the media is closely monitored in the country. Because so little is known about Burma within the Western world, I wanted to share my experience, but as I said, I felt like I really needed to make it relevant to this forum. Just before I left Yangon, the Burmese city I lived in, I happened to see an article reporting that 462 of Yangon's British colonial buildings had been deemed dangerous structures and would likely be condemned and destroyed. It occurred to me that one could learn a lot about the country through the collective history of these colonial buildings. Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon, became the country's capital under its brief and rocky colonial relationship with Britain. And when I say rocky, I mean that the British arrived in 1824, waged 3 wars for complete control, and the last ended in 1885. Today, Yangon is thought to have the most colonial architecture of any city in Southeast Asia. Beginning in the early 20th century, the Burmese started an independence movement, a cause later taken up by General Aung San, father of the current opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San began negotiating independence for the British after World War II, and just as he was trying to create a deal for several ethnic minorities who wanted control of their traditional lands, he was assassinated in front of the last building that you saw, which is called the Secretariat. For the next dozen years, the country was thrown into turmoil racked by internal ethnic conflict, and the beginning of the world's longest-running civil wars started there. The government took control of existing British colonial buildings and used them for their own purposes. In 1962, an army general named Ne Win took control of the government in a military coup, and in an economic style that many current scholars call faux socialism. Ne Win's regime controlled all industry and trade in Burma and shut the economy off to the rest of the world, and basically destroyed the entire infrastructure in the process. Luckily for the colonial buildings, Ne Win's wife was a professor and former head of the Historical Research Commission, and she persuaded Ne Win to preserve some of the colonial buildings, otherwise they would have been preserved in the name of progress. Throughout this time, people were still choosing to live in these buildings. For one thing, they were located downtown, which was still the economic hub of the country, and for another thing, employing techniques they had mastered in other hot and humid colonial locales, the British designed buildings were fairly cool without electricity and were suited to mixed use. Another reason these buildings persevered was that people were too poor to tear them down. Burma has sat at the bottom of the GDP list today with purchasing power parity. They rank 202 out of 237 nations. They're 174 of 179 countries ranked for the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. So facades began to crumble and plants grew into the buildings, especially the banyan tree, which the Buddhist majority of the country regard as sacred. And if a banyan tree started to grow on the roof of a house, they would just let it grow and not remove it, and that damaged the buildings. So in addition to the threat of neglect, colonial buildings sit on land now coveted by foreigners, especially Chinese, who, unlike Europe and the US, have no economic sanctions barring direct investment in Burma. Many of these companies prefer to demolish the existing buildings and start from scratch, creating malls and cheap residences and imposing yet another foreign architecture on Yangon. And in the late 1990s, the government created a preservation list to protect some 200 buildings in Yangon from demolition. However, there have been reports that some of the buildings have been destroyed anyways because if a building is considered damaged, then it gets taken off the list. Further, in 2005, the government abruptly moved the capital to a brand new city in the middle of the country called Naypyidaw. Residents said that this furthered the neglect in Yangon since government authorities now had little contact with the decay and declining infrastructure and thus no personal interest in restoring it. However, Yangon is still the economic capital of Burma, attractive to a small stream of tourists. Land values downtown continue to escalate as Burma and China's trade now represents billions of dollars. This, coupled with Burma's other trading partners, Thailand and India, mean that despite our Western sanctions, plenty of money is flowing into Burma, and with it a greater desire than ever to demolish colonial properties in order to capitalize on the land value. Another thing that is happening in Yangon, subject of the article that I read that inspired this whole presentation, is that the Yangon City Development Committee, also in charge of preserving these buildings, has been marking numerous buildings as dangerous, paving the way for their demolition. But dangerous is in the eye of the beholder. Media reports cite sources that claim the YCDC intentionally mislabels buildings, perhaps due to bribes by developers or building owners. It's not the dear old colonial buildings that suffer the most in this situation. When the YCDC labels a structure dangerous, residents must relocate as soon as possible or deal with developers who can take 6 months or more to rebuild the site. With the government called out regularly as the most corrupt in the world, according to Transparency International, it's not a stretch to imagine the only people this dangerous building process benefits are the YCDC employees and those bribing them. The result is displaced people, demolished homes, and the disappearance of a lot of beautiful old buildings. I'd just like to add, as a small aside, that some of the government buildings that are still in the that are still held by the government have been vacant for several years now, since 2005, and they're largely the home of squatters now. And when I asked what was going to happen with them, I was told that perhaps the government was trying to sell them in a way that they could launder money. So if you're interested in learning more about Burma or even going to Burma, there's flyers back there in the back on a table. I went with an organization called Teach for Myanmar, and also on October 22nd, we'll have an art exhibit with 8 Burmese artists, and if you'd like to learn more about that, just come and talk to me afterwards.